Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church in Columbia, South Carolina. We're part of the ELCA. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. It usually happens after a tragedy in our community. One particular event I remember was a high school student who was driving across railroad tracks when his car was hit by a train and he was killed. In the days that followed, several church members came to me rocked by the tragedy and deeply moved because they knew the family. In this particular case, they said to me, "Pastor, I'm just so concerned. This was a good family who lived good lives, but they never went to church and were lukewarm about faith. What will happen to this boy?" I responded in compassion, certainly, and as part of that response, I would say something like, "Let's pretend for a moment that you are God. If you were God, would you let that boy into heaven?" They all immediately responded, "Of course." Then I would say, "Well, if your grace can include him, how much greater will God's grace be?" It's a powerful point that we don't know and we can't presume upon the limits of God's grace. It's a point that St. Paul learned early on in a very personal way. I was thinking about these Pastor Gary Live episodes and pondering some weekly topics to explore together, and I thought about doing a week on things Paul said about living in Christian love. That seemed like a good topic to explore and talk about, but the more I thought about it, I also began to realize that for most of us, we know about Paul's life in snippets. We get this little part of the story at one time, and then there's another part sometime else, and it never all gets put in any kind of comprehensive order so that we get a sense of his whole life. So I put Paul on Christian love on the back burner for a while. We'll get to it eventually, but first, this week, we're going to look together at Paul's extraordinary life. Where it all began was really when Paul learned that we can't know the limits of God's grace. If you know anything about Paul's life, you are likely to know about his conversion to Christianity. In those early days, his name was Saul. Paul describes his early life as a Jewish Jew. And what he meant by that was that he was extremely devout and zealous for his faith. He was ardent about following the scriptures, which for him meant our Old Testament, and doing whatever he could to follow them to the letter. He involved himself in action that sought to stamp out anything contrary to those scriptures, and as far as he could tell, that meant the Jesus movement was gaining ground. So when one of the Christian deacons was caught preaching, a group of devout Jews stoned Stephen to death, and young Saul helped out by watching over the cloaks of those who were throwing the stones. Saul was in full support of the death of Stephen. But still you have to wonder what effect Stephen's forgiveness for those who killed him had on Saul. After that, Saul began actively to seek out and persecute Christians, and he heard that there was a group of Christians in Damascus, and he got a letter of permission to seek them out and arrest them and bring them back in chains, any that he found. It was on that road to Damascus, however, that he was struck by a bright light, and there he met the risen Jesus. "Saul, why do you persecute me?" he was asked. Others with him heard sound but couldn't make out the words. When the encounter was over, Saul was left blind. I think probably shaken too. He went on to Damascus, where Saul persisted in his blindness for 3 days. Meanwhile, God told one of his followers, a man named Ananias, to seek out Saul and heal him. Ananias probably couldn't believe that God wanted him to go to this guy persecuting Christians and offer himself up. But he went, and Saul was cured of his blindness and from that moment began to proclaim the name of Jesus that he had been persecuting before that. He changed his name from Saul to Paul to reflect the new person he had become. Again, of all the events in the life of Paul, that's probably the one we might know the best. What we may never have thought about is some of the things his conversion means. When he was Saul and was persecuting the Christians, he thought he was serving God. And maybe we all need to think about how we get caught up in our own agenda, the things we think are important, and miss what God is doing around us. Then, when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, suddenly, with Saul, we understand that salvation is not earned, but received through grace. Saul didn't do anything to be accepted by Jesus. Indeed, he had been intently working precisely against him. If God could welcome someone who was actively working against God, then how can we presume on the limits of God's grace? God's grace is beyond our understanding. We can also think about Saul's blindness as symbolizing the human condition apart from Christ, unable to see the truth until God opens our eyes. Our faith is not a decision or something we do. It is a gift from God to us. Frankly, this might challenge our assumptions about who can be saved. Put another way, it might challenge our assumptions about who will be in heaven. I once heard heaven described as the place that when we get there, we will enthusiastically agree that all those we see there should be there. We will finally see, not with our eyes, but with God's eyes of grace and love. Wrapped up in the unlimited love and grace of God, we might even agree that we should be there too. God's grace is that great. Thanks for sharing those moments with me, and remember to let this day belong to God.